The ship came down in the Valdris Flats at 3:47 local time, and by the time Sierra Voss reached the perimeter, the smoke was already thinning to gray wisps against the pre-dawn sky. It was not a warship. That was the first thing she noted as she badged through the security checkpoint and walked the last 400 meters on foot. The hull was low and broad, designed for cargo and passengers, not weapons, blocky at the stern where the drive units had failed, flatter across the midline, scored black along the port quarter where something had burned through during atmospheric entry. The landing struts on that side had collapsed. The ship listed 7 degrees off true. It was approximately 300 meters from end to end, and it sat in the middle of 500 hectares of flat scrubland that the First Contact Authority had designated as a provisional landing zone 6 years ago, on the assumption that if anyone ever came down unannounced, they would need room. Someone had come down unannounced. Sierra had her field kit, her translator array, her certification badge, and the explicit instruction from Deputy Director Mersch that she was not to approach the ship until he arrived from the capital. Mersch was 4 hours out by priority transport. The ship's emergency beacon had been transmitting for 90 minutes, cycling through every broad-spectrum frequency in the standard first contact protocols. No hostile emissions, no weapons active. The beacon's content, when her array parsed it, was a standard distress declaration under the Cascavel Conventions. Vessel disabled, passengers surviving, requesting humanitarian contact. She read the translation twice, then she kept walking toward the ship. The FCA perimeter security, 12 officers with rifles slung, nobody happy, did not stop her. She was the only xenobiologist with an active first contact certification within 200 kilometers, and the declaration on her badge said so, and none of the officers wanted to be the one who turned away the only certified person when something came out of that hatch. Something did come out of the hatch when she was still 60 meters away. It was small. Sierra had studied every catalogued alien contact record in the FCA archives, which meant she had read descriptions and seen reconstructed imagery, but nothing had prepared her for the size of it. The creature that stepped through the emergency hatch and stood at the top of the boarding ramp was roughly 1.5 meters tall, bilaterally symmetrical, covered in close-fitted scales that shifted color in slow, involuntary pulses, gray to amber to gray again. Its 4 limbs were jointed in 2 places each. Its head was narrow and large-eyed, with no visible nose structure and a mouth that moved with the same slow rhythm as the color shift. It stood at the top of the ramp and looked at her. She raised both hands, palms forward, and stopped walking. The creature at the top of the ramp looked at her hands. Then it sat down on the ramp. It folded its upper limbs across its chest and waited. Sierra had read every contact protocol ever written for situations like this. None of them had covered what to do when the alien simply sat down and waited. She activated her translator array, keyed the Cascavel emergency frequencies, and broadcast the standard human origin identification packet, species, location, intent, no hostility declaration. Her voice was steady. She was 31 years old. She had spent 9 years preparing for something exactly like this, and her hands were not shaking because she had decided they would not. The translator parsed the response in 11 seconds. The creature on the ramp was broadcasting on a low-power emitter that her array had detected but not initially flagged because it read as equipment noise. The translation came through in layers, the outer layer a standard origin packet that matched the Cascavel protocols precisely, the inner layer something rougher and more urgent that the translation engine rendered as 312 surviving, 17 injured requiring medical intervention, 14 juvenile state, 40 in acute distress from decompression exposure, requesting permission to disembark. Sierra looked at the ship. She looked at the perimeter behind her, where the security officers had spread out and at least 4 rifle muzzles were now tracking the hatch. She keyed her own low-power emitter and broadcast back. Identity confirmed. Authority status, working to clear disembarkation. Please remain aboard until medical clearance. The response was immediate. The translation engine stuttered over it. The syntax was compressed in a way that indicated stress, but what came through was, "We have already waited 6 hours in failing atmosphere. Please." She turned around and walked back toward the perimeter. The officer in charge was a woman named Kell, compact and deliberate, who had been on the line since the ship came down. Sierra told her what the translator had returned. Kell listened without expression. Then she said that she did not have authority to authorize disembarkation, that Deputy Director Mersch had operational command of the perimeter, and that the ETA was 3 hours 40. 17 injured, Sierra said, 14 juveniles. I heard you, Kell said. Failing atmosphere inside. They have been in there 6 hours. Dr. Voss, Kell said quietly. I have 11 people behind me whose threat assessment training says that ship is a possible invasion vector until proven otherwise. I need you to understand my position. I understand your position, Sierra said. I need you to understand theirs. She walked back toward the ship. The creature on the ramp was still sitting. It had been joined by 2 others, taller, older judging by the depth of scale color, who stood slightly behind and to either side in a configuration Sierra's memory flagged as protective rather than aggressive. Escort posture. The middle one, the original, met her eyes when she stopped at the base of the ramp. She broadcast again, direct and simple. She could not authorize full disembarkation. She could authorize medical personnel to enter the ship and render aid. Was that acceptable? The translation came back slowly this time, not from the emitter but from the creature's own mouth. A sequence of sound that the array rendered as, "You are not the one in authority here." It was not a question. It was a statement of observation, calm and complete, the kind of thing someone said when they had already understood the shape of a situation and were simply confirming it aloud. Sierra said, "No, but I am the one here." 47 minutes later, she had convinced Kell to allow 2 FCA medics inside the ship under her supervision, with weapons cleared from the entry corridor and a direct comm link to the perimeter. She had also contacted Mersch's office and left a message that she was characterizing as urgent and formal, which would go into the official contact record and would be there for review regardless of what Mersch decided when he arrived. She was not naive about what that meant. She was also not willing to let 17 aliens deteriorate further in a failed hull, because the person in charge was 4 hours away by transport. Inside the ship, the scale of it hit her all at once. 312 was an abstract number until she was standing in the main passenger compartment and could see them, arranged in rows along the sloped walls, sitting on the floor. The injured clustered near the aft section, where a medical station had been set up with equipment that her medics could not identify but could intuit. Children, the juvenile stage ones the translation had flagged, were grouped near the center, smaller, their color shifts faster and less controlled. Adults in postures that her field training said were defensive wrapping, limbs folded inward, heads down, the kind of stillness that was not calm but exhaustion. The 2 medics with her worked in silence and did not need to be told to keep their voices low. One of them, a field-trained emergency responder named Cortez, stopped in front of an injured adult whose scale color had gone almost entirely white. A reading Sierra did not have in any reference file, and looked back at her with a question he could not put into words. She did not know what white meant either. She told him to treat the physical injuries he could see and document every detail he could not interpret. He nodded and got to work without another word. The creature who had first met her on the ramp, she had begun to think of him as the speaker, though she had no data on their social structure, moved through the compartment with her and provided translated context in real time through the array. Their colony ship had failed in transit. They were from a dispersed population that had no single world, moving between 3 habitable stations in a system 2.4 light-years distant. The stations had been declared uninhabitable after a cascading infrastructure failure. They had loaded what they could carry. The drive malfunction had forced an emergency drop at the nearest viable planet, which was Earth, which they had located on charts shared under the Cascavel Conventions as a known inhabited world. They had not known if they would be welcomed. The speaker's translation of that admission was careful and precise. They had calculated the probability at 31%. They had debated the decision for 4 days aboard the failing ship, whether to attempt Earth or to continue on a slower trajectory toward a more distant cataloged world, knowing the drive margin did not cover the distance and the injured would not survive the transit. They had come anyway because the alternative was a certainty, and 31% was not zero. Sierra documented everything. The array recorded everything. She asked the speaker if he understood that the authority who would decide their status was not her. He said yes. She asked if he understood that the decision might not go in their favor. He said yes. She asked why he had come out of the hatch when she was still 60 meters away, alone, hands up. He said, because you stopped walking. Mersch arrived 3 hours and 19 minutes after her message. He was a careful man who did not raise his voice and who had been a bureaucrat his entire professional life, which meant that when he walked into the compartment and saw 312 displaced aliens and 2 FCA medics, his face did not change. He asked for a full briefing. Sierra gave him one methodically, with the array's record running. He listened. He asked precise questions. He thanked her for her documentation. Then he told her that her decision to enter the ship without authorization had created a political situation that was going to take time to resolve, and that she should be prepared for a formal review of her certification. She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You understand this changes your standing with the directorate?" She said, "Yes, sir." Then she went back to the speaker and told him that the man who had arrived was the authority, and that the authority would decide. The speaker looked past her at Mersch, studying him in silence for a long moment. Then he looked at Sierra. He said something that the array rendered in 2 passes, because the syntax was layered in a way the engine had not seen before. The first pass said, "We will remember you." The second pass said, "Even if the outcome is wrong, we will remember that you stopped." Mersch spent 6 hours inside the ship, asking questions, reviewing medical status, talking with his counterparts at the Capitol by Secure Link. Sierra sat outside on the running board of an FCA vehicle and watched the sun come up over the Valdris Flats and the smoke continue to thin. The security officers had stood down from active posture. 2 of them had brought a case of water to the base of the ramp without being asked, and one had found a folding chair from somewhere and placed it near the foot of the ramp, where the morning sun was already warming the ground. Nobody said anything about it. Nobody had to. The formal determination came at 14:30 local, transmitted from the Capitol by the Interior Minister's office. Provisional humanitarian status, 90-day review period, restricted zone designation while infrastructure was arranged. 3 conditions: full documentation and medical screening, FCA monitoring, no secondary disembarkation from Earth without review. Not sanctuary yet. The word for that was still a negotiation, still a document not yet signed, still a thing that could become something else depending on how the next 90 days went and what the political calculus looked like in the Capitol. Sierra knew this. She was not naive about the distance between provisional status and the thing they actually needed. But the hatch was open. The speaker stood at the top of the ramp and watched as the first group of passengers walked out into the thin morning light of a planet they had not expected to welcome them. The color shift in his scales moved from gray to something Sierra had not cataloged before, a slow, deep amber that held and did not cycle back. The review of her certification took 4 months. At the end of it, the board concluded she had acted outside her authority and within her mandate, which was a sentence that took the board's legal team 2 days to write, and which meant that she was formally reprimanded and formally retained. What she had not expected was the commendation from the Interior Minister's office that arrived the same day as the reprimand, citing her documentation as the factual basis for the provisional status determination and her field judgment as the difference between a contact record and a crisis that became one. She filed both documents together and did not choose between them. The speaker's people had a word for what she had done. The array rendered it approximately as witnessed and held, the act of being present at the moment of greatest uncertainty and refusing to move away from it. In their culture, it was considered the foundational act of any lasting relationship, the thing that had to happen before anything else could follow. First contact, Sira thought, had not been the moment the ship came down. It had not been the transmission or the ramp or the raised hands. It had been the moment she stopped walking and waited, and the creature at the top of the ramp sat down and waited back, and both of them stayed in that open space long enough for the other to become real. She wrote that into her official contact report. It was the last line of the document. The board did not strike it.